of the University of Regina. She'll be speaking on the new invader to Saskatchewan. What is the Prussian carp? The Prussian carp is a newly discovered invasive species to Saskatchewan. After being introduced in Alberta in the early 2000s, Prussian carp have reached Saskatchewan through the South Sask River, where they continue to increase their range and population. With this new invader, there's a lot of questions to be answered on their impacts on Saskatchewan water bodies. Looking at life history and how they make a living will help us understand potential effects of Prussian carp on our native lakes and rivers. Jayme Menard has her Bachelor of Science from City State University in North Dakota, and she did research on mussels, invertebrates, and aquatic systems. She graduated in 2020, where she came to the University of Regina, yay, to do her Master of Science in Biology on Prussian carp with Dr. Chris Summers. So I'll turn this over to Jayme. Welcome.
Hi, I'll just share my screen quick. Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Can you guys see, do you guys see the presenter mode, or do you just see the slides?
We see the presenter mode. So I think you just have to switch the which you're mirroring up on the top. Switch displays, I think.
I see what I did wrong there. Sorry about that.
This is the nature of online presentation.
Is that better?
Yep, looks like we just see your slides.
Awesome. All right, so I'll be talking about the new invader to Saskatchewan. What is the Prussian carp? Just like Fran said, my name's Jayme Menard. I got my Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Biology at Valley City State University in North Dakota. And now I'm currently working on my second year in my Master's of Science in Biology at the U of R. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about aquatic invasive species. So an aquatic invasive species is a species that can cause economic and ecologic harm and are a huge threat to aquatic ecosystems everywhere. A couple modes of introduction for aquatic invasive species. Typically it has to do with humans, but a couple aquatic invasive species have been known to be brought in through ballast water. So when a cargo ship were to bring a load in, they use the ballast to balance their load. They uptake water, which contains the invasive species. For example, this is how we think zebra mussels have reached the Great Lakes in the early 80s. The ballast travel with the full tank with all those invasive species. They come out and discharge their water when they go to take off their cargo and leave the invasive species where they traveled. Additionally, another mode of introduction is the pet trade. So, for example, you can release your exotic pet into an environment which can then grow into be an invasive. There are also invasive species are caused by introductions both inadvertently and on purpose. For example, sometimes there are releases from fish farms and the pet trade as well. A couple examples of aquatic invasive species. So aquatic invasive species can be any plant, mollusk, or fish that cause economic or ecological harm. A couple examples are zebra mussels and quagga mussels. These are the mussels that we have heard a lot about. They grab onto hard surfaces such as rocks, boulders, and other native mussels, and they attach on there, filtering out important nutrients, and are known to be a big problem in the eastern part of the continent. There's also the rusty crayfish, the Eurasian water milfoil, which once is introduced can take over and is just a weed bed, and the sea lamprey as well. So there's 4 different keys to being a good invader. One is that they're a generalist species. They mature quickly, they reproduce quickly, and they spread quickly. Not all introduced species are invaders, but invaders tend to have and cause harm to the environment. A couple examples of aquatic invasive fish. These 3 fish are aquatic invasive species, but are drastically different in the way that they are invasive. For example, the round goby, which is an invasive species to the Great Lakes, they are known to eat eggs and displaced fish from habitat and spawning areas, so they indirectly affect the ecosystem and cause harm to the native fish. Whereas the sea lamprey does a more direct way of being invasive, where they're a parasitic jawless fish. So lamprey suck onto, find a host, and they latch onto there, sucking out their blood to eat them. While they're sucking out their blood, the fish needs to use more energy to stay healthy, as well as when the lamprey does eventually detach from that fish, it decreases the energy used towards spawning, because it needs to heal the injury that the sea lamprey caused. And both of these invasives are known in the Great Lakes. And then a third different invasive species is the snakehead, and the snakehead is found in the southern states. This is originally from Southeast Asia. It is an aggressive fish. It is a predator, and it directly affects native fish by outcompeting them and potentially predating them. But I'm going to be talking about a special or a more specific type of aquatic invasive fish, which are invasive carp. Most people know invasive carp by the 4 Asian carps. These are known as big head carp, silver carp, grass carp, and black carp. These 4 invaders are very interesting because they all have a different niche. Big head and silver eat plankton. Silver are known to be the ones that jump. So if you've ever seen the video on Facebook that some guy's on water ski trying to catch a fish with a net, those are silver carp. Grass carp, just like their name, they eat plants. And so they can uproot plants and decrease vegetation for other species and habitat. And then black carp, they eat mollusks, and they can outcompete other species for resources. Common carp, which we have here currently in the Craven and the Capel chains. Common carp are considered naturalized in Saskatchewan. They were introduced in the late 1800s as a food fish and have since are in that area. Although in certain areas of the world, including Australia, they're considered an invasive carp because they make water murkier by uprooting plants and mixing the water. Additionally, an invasive carp that most people don't think of is if you take your little goldfish, do not do this, but if you take your goldfish and you were to release it into a pond, they are able to survive in those areas and grow to be quite big sizes. And when they impact the environment, they usually make the water a little bit murkier because they feed on the ground sediment or the bugs in the sediment. But as a whole, carp as aquatic invasive species are known to cause habitat degradation, water quality changes, and they tend to outcompete native species. So when carp are introduced into an area, they tend to reproduce very quickly, very prolific breeders, and they will outcompete natives for food and space, otherwise impacting those natives. The federal government has put in $20 million to prevent the 4 Asian carps, so the big head carp, the silver carp, the grass carp, and the black carp, from preventing them into the Great Lakes, and that is a current program being on. But today I'm going to be talking about a less known carp that has been recently introduced, and that's the Prussian carp. The Prussian carp was founded in Alberta and was found in the Red Deer River, the Bow River, and the Oldman River in the early 2000s, and has since spread to all 3. It has spread north into the South Saskatchewan River and is currently found in Saskatchewan. In 2006, there was 1 Prussian carp found in Swift Current Creek, but nothing was ever found after that, and it was kind of forgotten. Until 2018, where there was a winter kill in a lake, in a oxbow lake that is intermittently connected to Lake Diefenbaker when the water is high. Thousands of Prussian carp were found dead in a winter kill. So Prussian carp are a medium-sized fish. They are 50 centimeters, so about 19 inches in total. They're gold and brassy in color, and they originate from Serbia and Eastern Asia. A couple ways to ID them. This is just a couple nice pictures of them. So Prussian carp have large scales, are silvery flat-bodied that range in that 50 centimeters or 20 inches and under, and they kind of look like a deflated football. So if you were to take all the air out of a football or a rugby, that's kind of the shape that they look like. They also have serrated dorsal and anal spines. And unlike their cousin, the common carp, they do not possess barbels around their mouth. So that is a distinguishable characteristic between them and the common carp that we also have. One thing that's a little tricky with Prussian carp is that they look quite a lot like goldfish, and they're very closely related to goldfish. In total, all 4 of these images, although some of them look like Prussian carp, every single one of these pictures that are up on the screen right now are goldfish and not Prussian carp. So I told you that there was 4 traits that make a good invasive. One of them is being a generalist. So generalist refers to using just general habitat and eating general food. So Prussian carp have that. They are omnivorous, so they eat anything. 50% of their diet is chironomids. Those are bloodworms. They're found in sediment, and they're an integral part of lots of aquatic food webs. About 9% are consistent of water boatmen, and those are those aquatic insects that swim around on the top of the water. 30% are zooplankton. 5% is macrophytes, so actual plants, and another 4.6% is side swimmers or scuds or freshwater shrimp. And this is the diet, so they eat a wide variety of different foods. And this was found in a study done by my predecessor, Shana Hamilton. that found that majority of the diet of Prussian carp are these are chironomids and zooplankton, which account for a majority of their diet. A second generalist trait that Prussian carp have is that they're they can live in a wide variety of different environments. So Prussian carp are known to be able to survive very low amounts of dissolved oxygen, meaning that they can live in areas and water bodies that have little to no oxygen. They also can survive in salinity. So in some areas where they're invasive, in Turkey, for example, they are actually found in estuary environments, so brackish water, and are very tolerant to the salt content. Additionally, Prussian carp are known to be very resistant to pollution and pollutants, being able to survive concentrations of pollutants that other natives may not be able to. Another interesting fact about the Prussian carp is that they can survive in a wide variety of temperature ranges. So they're actually found to be able to survive in water bodies that freeze over during the winter. So some ponds that completely freeze over from top to bottom that Prussian carp have been found. They have been found to survive those winters, even though the lake has been completely frozen. Additionally, they are very resistant to high water temperatures as well, being able to survive in water that reaches 30 degrees, which in general is very stressful for most native fish, and usually cause very low oxygen in those environments. The second trait that I said that a good invasive has is that they grow very fast and they mature fast. These two images here, this one on the left, was taken when Prussian carp first emerged, and then only a few weeks later, this second photo was taken. And as you can see, the smallest and the largest of these two have significantly grown within 2 weeks. Additionally, Prussian carp are known to mature quickly, maturing at about age 3 in Europe. Prussian carp have a very interesting way of reproducing. They tend to reproduce multiple times a year. As you can see from this infographic from the Alberta government, Prussian carp can spawn up to 3 times a year and can spawn in a very wide temperature range. So anything above 14 degrees Celsius is usually pretty good for them to reproduce in. And each female can reproduce and make about 100,000 eggs per year. But the neat thing about Prussian carp is that Prussian carp actually use 2 different forms of reproduction. They use a sexual form of reproduction, which is how you and I are reproduce, where a female gives one piece of genetic material to their offspring, and the male gives one half of their genetic material to their offspring, and their offspring has one set of the female genetic material and one set of the male. Prussian carp use a different form of reproduction as well, which is asexual reproduction using gynogenesis. Gynogenesis is essentially cloning. So what gynogenesis is that the Prussian carp start with 3 sets of the female's genetic material. When a donor species, so Prussian carp, not only can they reproduce via cloning and asexual reproduction, but they can also use sperm from different organisms, different fish, to kind of start their reproduction. So they have 3 sets of genetic material. The donor sperm meets the egg, and then that initiates cell division, and the offspring the offspring results in a triploid clone of the mother. So with this, we expect there to be a very distinct sex ratios. So because Prussian carp are clones and they have an all-female population, we don't expect any males. And so we expect there to be 100% female and 0% males, but that hasn't been the case. In Stockwell Lake, this little guy in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, this little guy was a male. And so that brings a lot of questions of how is that male here? And if they're using gynogenesis, what reproductive method are they actually using? So the next thing is, where are they found? Again, they're found in the Oldman River, the Bow River, and the Red Deer River into the South Saskatchewan River, where they have moved north of the Gardner Dam and are north of the Weirs in Saskatoon. Where have we, as for our sampling, where have we found them? Prussian carp have been found from Leader all the way to north of Saskatoon, and these black triangles represent where we have sampled them. And this one circled black triangle represents the only fish that we have caught not using some sort of our citizen science program. Additionally, the green stars represent all the areas that I sampled my Prussian carp this year. Having had samples from Swift Current Creek, Big Phil and Ford's Coulee, Sunset Beach, and Cotto Bay on Lake Diefenbaker, and Stockwell Lake, which is found right here. So I guess the question is, what's the big deal? What's the threat of Prussian carp? And Prussian carp are likely to outcompete natives. So they overlap with perch habitat and white sucker diet, and in general, they reproduce very quickly and use resources that native species are likely to use. Not only that, but when Prussian carp enter an environment in an invasive area, they're very invasive as well in Europe, they tend to alter richness. So richness is the amount of species that are in an area, and this results in Prussian carp being the most abundant species. They come in, and within a few years, they can become the only, or if not, a vast majority of the fish found in those areas. Because of that, that can affect the recreational fishery, because if you're trying to go out for walleye and there's 100 Prussian carp to 1 walleye, you're likely to catch more Prussian carp than you are walleye, and that can affect recreational fisheries as well as the fun of going out fishing. Prussian carp, additionally, one factor that Prussian carp really pose a threat to is Prussian carp use and eat a lot of the resources that many native species use for their young of years. So younger fish or fish born in this, fish that are hatched in this year tend to use zooplankton and chironomids to eat, especially when they're developing before they're big enough to eat other fish. So if they use those resources, that may affect the ability for these native fish to survive. And finally, the biggest threat that Prussian carp hold is currently right now, they are in this where this yellow where it's colored in. They're currently all the way here, just north of Saskatoon, but now that they've passed the Weirs on Saskatoon, they pretty much have a straightaway shot at getting into the North Sask from where they're at. The only thing is that there are 2 dams on Tobin Lake by Nipawin, which may hold them back, although they have been able to pass the Gardner Dam as well as the Weirs in Saskatoon. Additionally, once they get in the North Sask, they can also work their way back towards Lloydminster and back into the Alberta border. But the biggest threat that Prussian carp pose is that the South Saskatchewan River isn't really their optimal environment. Carp tend to really like very productive areas that are green and that have lots of phytoplankton, and that is really, in southern Saskatchewan, the Qu'Appelle River. And right now, the only thing holding them back from getting into the Qu'Appelle River is the Qu'Appelle Dam on Lake Diefenbaker. Once they pass that, the Qu'Appelle River has lots of algae, lots of slow-moving areas for them for their young of year to be very successful in. It's a very optimal environment, as well as the Qu'Appelle River is the channel to the rest of the continent. So once Prussian carp reach the Qu'Appelle River, the rest of the environment from the Qu'Appelle River and into the rest of the continent are very good carp environments. So this kind of brings into, what do we know so far about Prussian carp? And we don't actually know very much about them. Since they're so new, we don't really have that much of a baseline information for what they do. So that kind of brings me into my research, which is I have 3 objectives. One is to determine the size and age distribution of Prussian carp in established populations in southern Saskatchewan, such as in Lake Diefenbaker and Stockwell Lake. Secondly, to determine the mode of reproduction used by Prussian carp in established populations in Saskatchewan. And thirdly, to determine whether Prussian carp spawn once or multiple times per year. And in doing that, to tackle my first objective, which is to characterize the age and growth, I'm really trying to answer 4 specific questions, which is, how old are they? How big do they get? How fast are they growing? And what size and age do they mature at? So to do that, I sampled in 7 different sites on Lake Diefenbaker and Stockwell Lake. These sites are Big Phil, Ford's Coulee, Elbow, Sunset Beach, Cotto Bay, and Pump House Bay. And I picked these because they are spread apart. These 2 are by the Qu'Appelle Dam, these 2 are by the Gardner Dam, and these 2 are in the middle where we had received some previous citizen science reports, as well as Stockwell Lake, which is a lake that we know for sure has them. And what I did was I did a biweekly cycle. I took fyke nets, which are trap nets, and so what they are is like a entrance, and then the fish swims inside it, and each consecutive hoop has a smaller opening, and so the fish can go forward but can't go backwards, and so they're live trap nets. And I cycled those into 2-day sets, and then I checked them every 24 hours, as well as I did 90 meters of seining. So I had me and my field assistant walk around in a circle and then pull the net into shore. And then any of the fish that were caught behind it were funneled into a bag where we sorted them out and determined which species they were. Additionally, I wanted to add deep water sampling because it was some sampling that we hadn't done for Prussian carp before. And so to do that, I set gill nets, which I attached to the bottom of the ground with weights. I ran a 30-meter gill net across, and then if the fish were to swim into it, they got caught, and then we would check them in the morning. And with sampling brings some shenanigans, whether realizing that the water got too deep in Lake Diefenbaker, that we ended up getting wet and having to go for a swim, or really enjoying salamanders that you don't get to see very often in the net, or when you give up on wearing your waders altogether and just bring out flippers and try to check the nets that way. We just had a lot of fun doing this work. And so what I caught this year was I caught 6,404 Prussian carp. 1,589 were from Stockwell Lake, and 4,815 of them were from Lake Diefenbaker. Majority of the Prussian carp that I caught were young of year, so you can see here this bag in my hand is full of really small Prussian carp, as well as this this cooler full of Prussian carp as well. We caught a lot of young of year Prussian carp in Cotto Bay, and that accounts for majority of the fish that I sampled this year. To answer my first question that I had, how old are they? I sampled I've aged 60 fish so far. All of these fish were sampled between 2018 and 2020. I haven't quite got to the fish that I've sampled this year. But these fish were sampled from Stockwell Lake and Diefenbaker, and they range between 0 and 12. And so how I did this was similar to how you age a tree trunk or a tree. Every year the tree deposits a new ring, depending on summer, winter, summer, winter. Well, bony structures do that as well. So I used the bony structures, currently the inner ear bones of Prussian carp, and I looked at light and dark bands on each inner ear bone and then counted them out. So this specifically is a 12-year-old fish. It is the oldest that I've sampled so far, and is a little bit higher than the average age that they say that they reach in Europe. My second question I wanted to answer when it comes to objective 1 is, how big do they get? You can see that this is the smallest Prussian carp that I sampled. It is a little larval. It is barely bigger than the tip of my finger, and it's about 1 centimeter long. And then our biggest sample was 42.5 centimeters. So approximately 16 inches, or as long as this ruler here. So not quite the 50 that it says the max is, but very, substantially larger than the average Prussian carp. And then my second question I wanted to answer is, how fast are they growing? I'm not 100% sure how fast they're growing yet. I haven't quite done that work, but you can see that I sampled this in July, and then I sampled this 2 weeks later, and the young of year are growing exceptionally fast. And I have a lot of data to sort through to answer this question still, but as far as I can say is that the young of year grow very quickly, but this is to be answered later on in my studies. The third question I wanted to answer with this is, and the last question I wanted to answer with this is, at what size and age do they mature? For males, it seems like they mature at around 21 centimeters, and for females, they seem to mature at around 25 centimeters. This difference in size usually has to do with the fact that females carry eggs and need to be a little bit bigger. And so I haven't done too much aging on this side, but my youngest mature fish that I've sampled is about 5 years old, which is a little bit older than the average in Europe. So this brings me to my second objective, which is reproduction. Since Prussian carp use such an interesting reproduction and how to have asexual and sexual reproduction, I wanted to know, what reproductive method are they using? And and what are the sex ratios. And essentially how I do that is I need to determine the sex. And to do that, I need to cut the fish open and look at their gonads. This image here on the left is a fish with testes, and then this image on the right is an image of Prussian carp ovaries. Ovaries tend to be orange and full of eggs, and testes tend to be white. So how am I going to determine their reproductive mode? Well, I'm using NORs, which are nucleolar organizer regions, and these have a set number of chromosomes. So they have two, essentially what it is I'm dyeing them with silver, and each chromosome set has 2 dots. With Prussian carp, because they are in the goldfish family, they actually have twice as much genetic material as most other carps, that we expect them to have 4 dots. And so if they are reproducing sexually and have 2 sets of genetic material, we expect them to have 4 dots in their cells. And if they're reproducing via gynogenesis, we expect them to have 6 dots and in their nucleus. And what you can see in this image is these cells have 6 dots, the one circled in the dotted line. These each have 6 dots in them, and then this one is solid and has 5 dots. This just to say that these do vary a little bit depending on how far along they are in their cell division, but that we expect diploids to have 4 dots and triploids to have 6 dots. So this brings me to my answer. What reproductive method is being used in Saskatchewan? Mostly gynogenesis. So it appears that most of them are clones, except for the males appear to be 4N. So it appears that the males seem to have an extra set of genetic material, which I'm not really sure the answer of, and we're working on trying to answer that question. And then my second question in this objective is, what are the sex ratios? This is the information from last year. We have not sampled a male in Lake Diefenbaker. All of the fish that we've sampled in Lake Diefenbaker have been female, whereas in Stockwell Lake, about 17% of the fish sampled are male, which brings on to the question of how did they come about? Moving on to my third and final objective is spawning. For that, I wanted to answer 2 specific questions. When do they emerge, and are there distinct cohorts? So cohort is just a grouping regarding age and size. So for example, each class, your first grade class, your second grade class, your third grade class would all be cohorts. And to do that, I did weekly sampling on Cotto Creek here, where the green arrow is. I did weekly sampling with a small trap net. So similar to my nets that I used for my actual sampling, I use these to catch larval fish and larval and smaller fish, and I checked those every week. And what I found is that Prussian carp emerged in the 8th week of my field season, which was about July 6th. Right here, Prussian carp represent the tealish color, and by the 11th week, they became the most abundant species in that region, accounting for almost 50%, and then keep being the most abundant species for about 3 weeks, so early August, and then slowly moving down a little bit in the abundance as different fish moved in later on in the summer. And what I found when Prussian carp arrived, they arrived pretty significantly. So if you keep your eye in this little area here, by the top of these weeds, you can see that Prussian carp are actually moving, are actually swimming away from me, and that's how it was all summer. We would be walking through by the end of the summer, we'd be walking through that area, and Prussian carp would just be swimming away from us, essentially being numerous in the millions in that region. And then my final question that I wanted to answer was, are there distinct cohorts? It's kind of unclear so far. As you can see, there are varying sizes in the young of year that I caught. So that could just be from resource use. So essentially, a fish could be caught, or a fish could hatch 2 days before another, and use those 2 days to get more resources, or they're just a little bit more competitive and able to use or able to eat a little bit more, resulting in them getting a little bit bigger. But I also sampled a lot of fish, and as you can see, this group look very similar in size and potentially indicate that there might be groups that arrive throughout the summer. And this is something that I'm going to be looking more into with my young years that I've sampled this summer. And so finally, just as like a takeaway for what I'd like you guys to take away from this presentation is Prussian carp are here in Saskatchewan. We don't have very much information on them here in North America, and so that is the nature of my work, is to understand a little bit more about their life history and their growth and how they reproduce. And thirdly, they are a potential danger to the rest of the continent. If they do reach past the Qu'Appelle River, that is into the Qu'Appelle River, that seems like it's going to be a very good environment for them to be extremely successful. Finally, I would like to thank the University of Regina, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment, and the Fisheries Unit, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment, the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, and FGSR at the University of Regina, as well as Dr. Chris Summers, Linnea McClellan, and everyone else in the Saskatchewan Sportfish Group for helping me out with this with this program. And I'd love to take your questions if you have any now.
Okay, thank you very much, Jayme. That was fascinating information. At this point in time, I think the recording of tonight's meeting will end. And from here, we'll just go